Hello folks, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today is Tuesday, June 25th of 2013. I think that today will live on as an extremely sad day, perhaps one of the saddest days in American history. It took 100 years for the United States to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It took several months for the Supreme Court to come to a decision to invalidate an entire section of that Voting Rights Act, one which required several states in the United States, as well as some other parts of the United States, isolated areas, to request federal permission before making any changes to their voting laws as a way of protecting the rights of minorities, in particular African Americans, in the United States. That Voting Rights Act has been employed as recently as last year, 2012, when at least two states attempted to pass laws which would have required people to carry voter IDs, which was an obvious attempt to reduce the rate of minority turnout. People who are minority and poor often are less likely to have an ID, and so that was an obvious attempt to get more Republican votes, kind of a gerrymandering of a more individual sort. Well, today is when all of that has come to an end, in the sense that there is really no way in which the federal government can, under present provisions, act as a referee to prevent states, like Texas, for example, from enacting legislation which is specifically designed to prevent minority voter turnout, which is precisely what many people want to happen. Many Republicans know that the higher the rate of minority turnout, the less of a chance they have of getting elected. That's just simple math. Many Democrats know that the higher the rate of minority turnout, the better chance they have of getting elected. That's one reason why, for example, more Democrats than Republicans support the idea of Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state. So it's all politics. And I am not trying to be partisan, either supporting one side or another. All parties engage in activities from time to time which has been self-serving and unethical. This decision was not specifically made by a political party. It was made by the justices of the Supreme Court, but primarily the conservative justices of the Supreme Court. It was a very clear ideological vote among the justices of the Supreme Court. So my concern is one that I will express now. You may or may not agree with me. This is based on my own personal interpretation of the Bahá'í texts. First, let me read a selection from a letter that was sent by Shoghi Effendi, It is included in his book Citadel of Faith, pages 124 to 126, and I will not read the whole thing, just one brief excerpt of that. Pervading all departments of life, an evil which the nation, the United States, and indeed all those within the capitalist system, though to a lesser degree, share with that state and its satellites, regarded as the sworn enemies of that system, is the crass materialism which lays excessive and ever-increasing emphasis on material well-being, forgetful of those things of the spirit on which alone a sure and stable foundation can be laid for human society. No less serious is the stress and strain imposed on the fabric of American society through the fundamental and persistent neglect by the governed and governors alike of the supreme, the inescapable and urgent duty so repeatedly and graphically represented and stressed by Abdu'l-Baha in his arraignment of the basic weaknesses in the social fabric of the nation, of remedying, while there is yet time, through a revolutionary change in the concept and attitude of the average white American toward his Negro fellow citizen, a situation which, if allowed to drift, will, in the words of Abdu'l-Baha, cause the streets of American cities to run with blood, aggravating thereby the havoc which the fearful weapons of destruction, raining from the air, and amassed by a ruthless, a vigilant, a powerful, and inveterate enemy, will wreak upon those same cities. At the time Shoghi Effendi wrote that, the world was in the middle of the Cold War. I remember the Cold War. It was a very dangerous period of time, very fearful time. I recall when I was in elementary school, going through those old duck and cover drills in the early 1960s, watching that duck and cover video, or actually movie, which portrayed a turtle ducking inside of the shell in order to prevent himself from being attacked. It was in retrospect, a comedic video. It presented a real oversimplification of the dangers of nuclear war. For example, it said that if you see a nuclear blast, go and simply drop to the ground, duck and cover, and it shows a little boy doing that and then getting up with a big smile on his face and simply wiping the fallout off of his clothes. Not very realistic, but it served a purpose. It was an empowering video attempting to make people feel somewhat relieved or less concerned about the devastating possible consequences of nuclear warfare. Well, if we consider that passage from Shoghi Effendi's letter that I just read, it appears to me that he is talking about the relationship between the United States and the former Soviet Union. For example, that state and its satellites, regarded as the sworn enemies of that system, is, it seems to me, again, an apparent reference to the Soviet Union and its satellites, such as Poland and Hungary and so forth. Then, when he goes on and refers to the ruthless, vigilant, powerful, and inveterate enemy, again, it appears to me to be referring to the former Soviet Union. So, after quoting that passage in my book called Unitive Socialism, and I will include a link to this book below this program, I offer my own thoughts on what happened. And I begin by saying that fate or predestination, and perhaps also prophecy, can be sometimes impending or conditional. Baha'u'llah, for example, wrote in Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah, page 133, "Know thou, O fruit of my tree, that the decrees of the sovereign ordainer, as related to fate and predestination, are of two kinds. Both are to be obeyed and accepted. The one is irrevocable, the other is, as termed by men, impending. To the former, all must unreservedly submit, inasmuch as it is fixed and settled. God, however, is able to alter or repeal it. As the harm that must result from such a change will be greater than if the decree had remained unaltered, all therefore should willingly acquiesce in what God hath willed, and confidently abide by the same. The decree that is impending, however, is such that prayer and entreaty can succeed in averting it." Similarly, Abdu'l-Baha said in his table talks recorded in the book Some Answered Questions, page 244, "Fate is of two kinds. One is decreed, and the other is conditional or impending. The decreed fate is that which cannot change or be altered, and the conditional fate is that which may occur. Conditional fate may be likened to this: while there is still oil, a violent wind blows on the lamp, which extinguishes it. This is conditional fate. It is wise to avoid it, to protect oneself from it, to be cautious and circumspect. But the decreed fate, which is like the finishing of the oil in the lamp, cannot be altered, changed, or delayed. It must happen. It is inevitable that the lamp will become extinguished." So it appears to me that the passage I read earlier from Citadel of Faith by Shoghi Effendi was an example of conditional or impending fate or predestination. The fact that we had affirmative action laws in the United States enacted in the 1960s, the fact that the Voter Rights Act was signed in 1965, although certainly they did not completely eliminate institutionalized racism in the United States. Indeed, there still is tremendous institutionalized racism in this country. Still, it was a step in the right direction. Perhaps it was sufficient to avert the immediate disaster. Well, now, getting back to what happened today. One of the main features of the American Civil Rights Movement, as I said, was this Voting Rights Act. It was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Section 4 of the Act, which was the one that was repealed or found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court today, required several of the states with long histories of racial discrimination to receive federal approval before making any electoral changes. Now, there is no more Soviet Union. So obviously the scenario which was outlined by Shoghi Effendi is not going to be at least precisely the one which will happen. My concern, however, is this, and here is again what I wrote in this book. The South of the 21st century is, in many respects, different from the South of the 1960s. Yet, the recent Southern record of attempted voting discrimination against minorities has been less than exemplary. However, if the old white South attempts to rise again, in a manner of speaking, much more blood might fill the streets. Here is the actual text of what the Supreme Court said. Again, this was the majority 5-4 decision. States retain broad autonomy in structuring their governments and pursuing legislative objectives. Indeed, the 10th Amendment reserves to the states all powers not specifically granted to the federal government, including the power to regulate elections. There is also a fundamental principle of equal sovereignty among the states, which is highly pertinent in assessing disparate treatment of states. The Voting Rights Act sharply departs from these basic principles. Nearly 50 years later, things have changed dramatically. Largely because of the Voting Rights Act, voter turnout and registration rates in covered jurisdictions now approach parity. Blatantly discriminatory evasions of federal decrees are rare, and minority candidates hold office at unprecedented levels. Now again, I am not going to get into the politics of whether that is or is not a good decision. Obviously, many Republicans are rejoicing. Many Democrats are sobbing over it, with exceptions, of course. There are obviously people in both parties who have other views. But my concern is not so much this, I guess my sentiments are pretty clear from the way I'm presenting this. I'm trying not to be political. But my concern is this, that if this provision is taken advantage of by many states in the South, many states that were at one time covered by Section 4 of the Voter Rights Act, if they take advantage of it, as they do now appear to be doing, especially in Texas, and if they do make legislation which will create more obstacles for minorities to be able to vote in their respective states, that perhaps another punishment, not the same since there's no Soviet Union, but obviously I'm speculating, but another punishment just as devastating, if not more so, may afflict this country. Shoghi Effendi referred to racialism or racism as the most challenging issue afflicting American culture. I think it remains that way today. And with racism, which is so closely tied in with classism or class discrimination in the United States, if racism is allowed to raise its ugly head even more than it has been, as for example all of the accusations that President Obama is a secret communist, socialist, Kenyan, what have you, if those kinds of problems continue to percolate, then my concern, honestly, is for my country. I would like to be proud of my country, and in times when I think my country is behaving in a just way, I am proud of it. This does not make me very proud. It makes me concerned. And I don't think necessarily that it will be tremendously damaging. I have faith that God will protect us in whatever way God desires to do so. But my concern is also, to be perfectly honest, for the individuals who support this type of change in the Voting Rights Act. This is what I mean. Imagine that you have a person with tremendous power in this world, very high status, a lot of money, has behaved in an extraordinarily oppressive way. Obviously, figures like Hitler and Stalin come to mind, but of course there are many others, including many people who are alive today who are behaving in an extraordinarily oppressive way, and members, I think, of the U.S. Congress as well, and other institutional bodies who are behaving oppressively. Imagine that you are a person like that, who had that power to protect your own agenda, your own place in political office. Then all of a sudden you die, as we all will eventually, and you end up in the next world, and all you have is yourself. You have your memories, you have whatever attributes you failed to acquire, as well as those you did, but in effect you are alone. The power is gone. The possessions are gone. That, I think, is the ultimate hell for people who behave in this kind of discriminatory way. Again, that is only my own personal view, but I figured I would share it with you nonetheless. Until next time, this is Dr. Mark Foster. Have a good one.